Another is, of course, what will happen to Brexit. This now has become almost surreal as a policy area. The trade talks are running out of time, and a year ago this drama would have sucked up virtually all media and political attention. Now I feel almost apologetic raising the issue, but the implications are huge for the UK and with immediate consequences as soon as January the 1st. The issue is also surreal because each week begins with a proclamation that the next days are going to be make or break, and then the talks resume again the following week. What's going on? Charles Grant runs the Centre for European Reform, and Stephen Booth works for Policy Exchange, the centre-right think tank. Both follow every twist and turn of these talks. Not that there have been many twists and turns in recent weeks, or so it seems. First, Charles Grant gave me his assessment of the state of the talks.
There are still at least three very difficult areas that haven't been resolved, and from the EU's point of view, Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, needs to take a political decision to compromise on those areas. And of course, the EU understands it has to compromise too in certain of these areas. The areas are fish, a very difficult area, economically irrelevant but very important area politically. The governance of the arrangements, how the decision-making and dispute settlement works, and then the so-called level playing field issues, whether there's a viable state aid regime for limiting subsidies and also making sure the British don't go backwards on social and environmental rules. Those are the three most difficult areas remaining. We're not quite at the end of the road yet. If we go beyond next week, it's going to be very difficult to get a deal done this year because of the time taken to ratify in the European Parliament.
Stephen Booth, is it your sense that the government has moved at all on any of those three, the state aid, level playing field, fishing? Will it move in the coming days?
I think if you look at the starting positions of both sides, there was a long way to go, and I think ultimately both sides have moved. If you look at where the EU started from on some of these issues, I think the UK actually has been quite successful in moving the EU closer to its position. I mean, I get the sense that the UK is prepared to make compromises on some of these issues, but the presentation of that is quite difficult, particularly on things like fishing, where, as Charles says, it's not macroeconomically significant. However, politically in the UK, it is clearly very significant if you consider the politics of, say, the Union and the importance of fishing to certain communities in Scotland and a sort of the victory that would present for Boris Johnson if he's able to do a good deal there. And I think partly the risk of this the whole way through has been not only would the UK not be willing to compromise, but potentially that the EU senses that it feels it has the upper hand due to events and it pushes the UK too far. And there's always that risk that the talks do break down. And I think, we'll find that out in the next 10 to 14 days, probably.
So Stephen Booth, Charles Grant, puts it 10 to 14 days. But you did say if by the end of this coming week, we still don't know whether there's an agreement or the basis of an agreement, you think that is it? Both sides then are leading towards no deal.
I think no deal becomes more likely, but deadlines are always very flexible in the EU. The EU's official position is the transition period cannot be extended beyond the end of this year into early next year. It's just legally not possible. And it is true that the transitional period, as contained in the withdrawal agreement, cannot be extended. But if we just need another kind of week or two to sort out some little issue that needs to be sorted out, I think the heads of government would say to the EU lawyers and the Council of Ministers, look, find a legal mechanism that allows us to effectively keep a status quo for another couple of weeks. Probably the lawyers could find some way of doing it that might be rather messy. But nobody's going to do that unless there's unanimity that should be done, including with the British. So if there are big differences of principle, as there still are today, then I think the end of the year is the end of the year, and that's the end of the negotiation, and Britain leaves without a deal on January the 1st. If there's been a lot of progress, but one or two outstanding issues need another week or two, then we could extend the transition into next year, probably.
Yeah, I agree with Charles. I think we are reaching a point where decisions will need to be made over the next week to 2 weeks, because ultimately I think that we have gone around in circles on these three issues for long enough now that I think every plausible landing zone will have been looked at by both sides. The question now is, what are the trade-offs that are willing to be made at the last minute? What are the political calculations on both sides about how easy it is to sort of sell a deal domestically? And those are ultimately very political decisions. And I think the negotiators, will have done all the technical work for all the plausible outcomes now. The question is which of those outcomes are palatable on both sides of the table.
Charles Grant, one of the few public manifestations of what's going on are the tweets of David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator, and they are wholly unyielding about the purity of sovereignty and independence as he sees it. Is that a reflection of what he really thinks?
He is taking a very tough line. My view is the political imperatives pushing Boris Johnson and therefore David Frost towards the deal in the next few days, if no deal looms as a real prospect, are actually quite numerous, and they're quite powerful. I mean, I think the government has a worry already about its reputation for competence because of the way it's handled the COVID-19 epidemic. And if there is no deal at the end of the year, the chaos at the borders will be even worse than it's going to be already. If there's a deal, it'll be quite chaotic at the borders, and everybody knows that. But if there's no deal, it'll be worse because of the need to check for tariffs. Then there's the Scottish factor. Michael Gove, an important cabinet minister, is certainly aware that if there's a no-deal Brexit and chaos at the borders, that'll augment support for the SNP and their wish for independence in Scotland. Then there's business lobbies who've been very, very quiet so far this year because they thought that they spoke out, they wouldn't be listened to by Number 10. For all these reasons, I think Boris Johnson will go for a compromise within the next few days. But of course, I can't be sure of that, and that's just my supposition based on what I see as the political imperatives affecting him.
I tend to agree with Charles that I think a deal is more likely than not, but I think, however, the risk of a no deal remains. I think the benefit of a deal is not simply the fact that you remove tariffs and therefore one of the major frictions on trade. Clearly, even the trade deal that we are talking about, relatively, as you said, relatively thin, will require more checks and therefore will necessitate some greater friction on UK-EU trade. But I think the benefit of it having a deal, both sort of economically but also politically, will be that I think that if there is a deal, both sides will be invested in trying to make it work, at least for the short to medium term. And I think whilst we're not likely to have a sort of formal implementation period, if you have a deal where both sides are invested in making it work, I think there will be some attempts to limit that disruption that may occur and limit any friction. Whereas I think under a no deal, I think that's a much bigger potential problem because people on the ground won't have the political pressure to sort of possibly go easy on some of the checks that they might be able to do, say, in the first 6 months of implementing a deal which the politicians feel happy about.
And Charles Grant, could I ask you, I mean, you speak to a lot of figures around the European Union. Are they as worried about a no deal from their perspective? Of course, some people in the UK are okay about it. Are they as worried in the European Union?
I think they are worried about no deal. Mrs. Merkel, the preeminent leader, is certainly worried. But my worry is that Emmanuel Macron may not be as worried as he should be. I think there's 26 governments around the EU who are very keen to get a deal, who see the damage that no deal would cause to the political cohesion of Europe vis-à-vis Russia, China, and so on. But I think the French, unlike the others, actually have a view that the British must be seen to suffer a bit to discourage other countries from being so stupid as to leave the EU. My worry is that Emmanuel Macron won't make the compromises that he needs to make on fish at the last minute. The EU believes, and in my view rightly, that the economic damage of no deal would be disproportionately greater in the UK, but it certainly would hit northern France, Flanders, the Netherlands, and hit some of our partners and the German export industries quite badly as well. So I think if Angela Merkel gets her way, there will be a deal, but I worry a little bit about Macron's willingness to compromise.
Charles Grant and Stephen Booth.